The expectation, in some sense, was that what had happened in other parts of the post-Cold War world would happen in China. And I think what we've learned is that that gamble, that expectation, has been proved wrong.
Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and on the show today, how the US-China relationship has devolved to its most dangerous point in decades. On technology, trade, defense, human rights, and the coronavirus response, tensions have reached a fever pitch. I'll get into all of that and more with Zanny Minton Beddoes. She's editor-in-chief of The Economist. Fireworks. Practice is thought to have started in China around 600 AD when alchemists mixed potassium nitrate, sulfur, and charcoal, along with tiny bits of cast iron. Then they packed it all in bamboo, ignited it, and boom. Pyrotechnics have been a part of major Chinese events ever since, including the modern nation's 70th anniversary. In Chinese folklore, fireworks are used to scare off evil spirits, which is interesting because they were also recently sent off in front of the U.S. consulate in Chengdu after China ordered its closure. A tit-for-tat response to the U.S. shutting of the Chinese consulate in Houston due to allegations of espionage. U.S.-China relations have been plummeting. Travel between the two sides is restricted. Tech relations have sunk into a new Cold War. Beijing is consolidating control over Hong Kong and threatening Taiwan, while its internment of Uyghurs at home has grown ever more severe. The two sides are fighting over the South China Sea as well. Pretty much everything is heading towards decoupling at this point, from private investment to student visas. Even finger-pointing over coronavirus has reached a fever pitch. In the United States, backlash against China attracts rare bipartisan support, while its cover-up of the pandemic's early days has spawned global investigations. China, meanwhile, is moving ahead with plans to become a world leader in artificial intelligence, expanding massive loans to developing countries and rerouting global trade with Beijing at the center. Yet coronavirus has shaken the globalization that lies at the heart of China's extraordinary rise. And as the global economy contracts, a breakdown in phase one of an increasingly fragile trade deal between China and the U.S. is in almost nobody's interest. So if you're sitting in Beijing or Washington, how do you fix this? Do you even want to? Or do you simply sit back and wait for more fireworks? Zanny Minton Beddoes, editor-in-chief of The Economist, is here to explain. Very good to be with you, Zanny.
Very nice to see you too, Ian, as always.
So the big fight right now, the Americans and Chinese, gloves are off. Do you think we are now heading into a new Cold War?
Well, we are certainly in a period of really terrible US-China relations, and they've been getting worse for years, and this year in particular, as the pandemic hit, and even frankly in the last few weeks, things have got worse and worse.
China has taken over the premises of the US consulate in the southwestern city of Chengdu. It ordered the diplomatic mission there to close in response to the United States closing the Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas last week.
Do I think it's a new Cold War? Well, I have some issues with the framing Cold War. The old Cold War was between the USSR and the USA. The USSR, Soviet Union, very important nuclear power, ideological foe, but frankly, economic minnow. The difference with China is that China is a huge economy with which we're very integrated. So I'm not sure the phrase is the right one, but yes, we are heading to very, very worrying relationship between these two countries.
Now, before we get into what's at stake, I kind of want to go back a bit, because if we think about 1989 and the wall came down, the Soviets had their Gorbachev, but the Chinese, Tiananmen Square, very different lesson, right? We didn't win that.
I think two very important things happened in 1989. One, as you say, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, and with it, the sense that the US had won the Cold War. And, Frank Fukuyama publishes The End of History with a question mark, and there is a sense of, the ideological supremacy of Western liberalism is there, and there's that kind of unipolar moment, US reigns supreme. The other thing that happened, as you say, in 1989 was Tiananmen Square. And I think what we're realizing now is that what happened in Tiananmen Square actually is sort of, the shadow of that is driving the early 21st century much more than the aftermath of the hubristic moment of 1990 in the sense of US, unipolarity. So, you're right that the expectation was, I think, in 1990s, 2000s, that as China integrated into the world economy, China would be created that would be a responsible stakeholder that would, the most optimistic people hoped, become, a more democratic, more liberal place. The expectation, in some sense, was that what had happened in other parts of the post-Cold War world would happen in China. And I think what we've learned is that gamble, that expectation, has been proved wrong. China has indeed grown extraordinarily. The most amazing, poverty reduction we've ever seen, the world has ever seen, an unbelievable increase in standards of living. The Chinese economy has grown dramatically, but it has not really become, in important ways, a responsible economic stakeholder. And at the same time, and now increasingly under President Xi Jinping, really obviously, it's becoming, if anything, more authoritarian. And so that sort of underpinning that the logic that said, if you bind China into the global system, it will become, more like the rest of the system, doesn't seem to have been upheld. And I think now what we face is the consequences of how do we deal with a China that is the world's second biggest economy, that has incredible links with all of our economies. It's a very, very powerful player that is increasingly assertive, but which has a very different ideological framework. It is absolutely not a democracy or going to be anything like that, but it is a country with which we're really interlinked.
So we think about what's happening now, and you put a very clear point that the Americans and Chinese do need each other. Do you think, right now in the United States, being hawkish on China, is almost the only game in town? Do you think that's appropriate? And if so, how much so?
There has been in the US over the past few years a growing recognition on both sides of the aisle that the old approach wasn't working, that at a kind of level of trade and the economy narrowly, China wasn't playing by the rules, and that integration and into access to the WTO hadn't really changed China. And so the question I think that the US has been grappling with, and everybody else sort of by extension, is how do you deal with a country with which your economies are extremely integrated? Think of global supply chains, think of the number of companies that produce things in China, think of the integration. And so how can you safely continue that integration, continue that interaction with a country whose ideology you absolutely don't share and that you fundamentally don't trust? And I think what the US has been going through in the past 3-4 years, accentuated by the president and the Trump administration, because as so often, President Trump, in a kind of somewhat clumsy and transactional and crude way, identifies a real issue.
President Nixon once said he feared he had created a Frankenstein by opening the world to the CCP. And here we are.
But what I don't think we have yet is a consensus or indeed a kind of strategic sense about how you go from the old world where you hope that integrating with China would make it a responsible stakeholder to managing relations with a country with which you are integrated, but which you no longer trust. So the simple, which is kind of why I find this metaphor of the new Cold War or this adage not that helpful, because the new Cold War suggests, well, it'll be like the old Cold War. We'll have nuclear deterrence, we'll have military buildup, we'll disentangle our economies. But let's just think through what that means. It means really an unwinding of a lot of the globalization we've had so far. It means, what does it mean for third countries? What does it mean for countries in Europe? What does it mean for countries in the emerging world who have very close links with both economies? So I think we haven't really thought through how to do it, let alone how do we deal with the kind of common challenges we all face, and the pandemic is the obvious one, but climate change, all these huge global challenges which we can only deal with if the US and China can work together.
The hawks in the Trump administration would say, actually, the dangers of military confrontation go up if we ignore this. It's now when there's still asymmetrical power towards the United States. China's the second largest economy. They don't have the military capabilities. They're still comparatively weak. This is when we need to pressure them as much as humanly possible in order to align, to get them to play more by American rules, or else this is going to hurt them a lot more than it hurts the West.
I've heard that argument too. That's the argument you hear from a lot of US hawks. But let's play that through, because my question always then is, okay, but what is your end goal? What is it you're actually trying to get China to do? Because I think there is a growing view in China that what the US really wants is to keep China down, to prevent China from returning to what it sees as its rightful place at the kind of world's top table. And I think, similarly, in the US, there is a growing view that what China seeks is sort of global domination. And kind of Xi Jinping has some sort of expansionist, global, hegemonic ambition of his own. Those two visions are fundamentally incompatible. So unless both sides can find a strategic vision that they can both sign up to that allows them to sort of acknowledge the other giant power's existence, we're in real trouble.
I wonder, clearly China has been and is a rising power. And irrespective of what kind of end goals you impute for Xi Jinping, some level of accommodation needs to be made, and some level of, are you going to let them be at the table, needs to be answered. So, I look, for example, at this Huawei issue, where the United Kingdom and your prime minister had said that they wanted to work with Huawei, they were going to let them in, and there was an about face. What do you think, if there were a proper strategy between the US, the UK, and allies, is that strategy that we want to destroy Huawei?
So let me kind of abstract from Huawei itself, because I think you have to take a couple of steps back. In a world of no trust, where you don't trust this behemoth of a trading partner at all, and you certainly are leery of its ideology and its underlying goals, what is the kind of trading architecture you could create for that? And I think that it involves thinking about what areas of your economy are critical such that you would not want to have any involvement from companies from that country. And I think it may well be that 5G is rightly on that side of the line. But I think what we haven't had is a kind of going through, what is included, what is critical, what is not critical. Is it okay to buy T-shirts from China? I assume so. What is it not okay to do?
Well, I mentioned the Huawei issue because, you said, well, maybe it's okay to sell T-shirts, presumably. Well, if Huawei's on the wrong side of the line and those T-shirts have chips in them, then it probably isn't, right? In the sense that anything...
If your argument is that having Huawei infrastructure in your 5G is dangerous because, it is unclear what they do, some parts of it are made in China, it's going to become harder now. One part of the argument was that because of the recent US sanctions, the oversight of Huawei infrastructure that the UK had pioneered. The UK has, for the last few years, had this special office that essentially looks at all Huawei infrastructure to make sure that it is okay. That process of oversight has become much harder because of the US sanctions. So that's one argument, that you can no longer trust, you can no longer verify, and in the absence of trust, if you can't verify, it's too dangerous.
We convinced many countries, and I did this myself for the most part, not to use Huawei because we think it's an unsafe security risk.
But the second is that you have to think, well, what about Microsoft or Apple, who's produces a huge amount in China? What is it? What can we actually produce there? What can we? If we can't have any form of integration, that involves a much greater decoupling, both of software and of hardware, that I think anybody has thought through, because the most extreme version is that you have to have two tech ecosystems, separate hardware, separate software companies, completely different. But even if you go down that route, then what do countries, the third-party countries, do if you're in Indonesia or in India or a Brazil?
Yeah, they'll have to choose. There's no question. But you put your finger on something we hadn't talked about yet. because we've been mostly framing this in terms of governments, but you mentioned Microsoft, you mentioned Apple. Do you see a sea change in the private sector, or do you think it's going to be much more divided over the coming years?
I think it's going to be more divided. I think it's going to depend on where your main markets are, on what you're doing, on how big and important the Chinese market is for you. So I think a conglomerate based in Asia will have a very different outlook to one based in the UK, certainly in the US. But I suspect that what we're seeing is the US itself is increasingly off limits to Chinese companies, I think, of all sorts, and that the US will be a sort of outlier. But the bit that will be tricky is what happens in Europe, what happens in Africa, what happens in the fast-growing emerging markets. If we're thinking, not 1 year, but 10 years, what are we trying to create here?
Two other issues I want to get to that we haven't talked about. One, Hong Kong. Precisely because this is what's driven some of the harshest blowback from the United Kingdom with the functional ending of the one state, two systems rule, now that we have this new national security law.
This is the end of Hong Kong. This is the end of one country, two systems.
But we see the Germans, the largest economy in Europe, saying, we're not going to let Hong Kong affect our trading relationship with China. It's too important. But has China become functionally too big to really push back on some of these critical political issues?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not if the West acts in unison. Absolutely not. I mean, I think that what you're absolutely right, that Hong Kong has brought home very powerfully, I think, in the UK political circles, that what China is up to, and that it has essentially, ripped up the agreement that was there, that it is absolutely focused on what it sees as, its own national security and preventing Hong Kong becoming any kind of, hotbed of festering opposition to the regime. It is, a very, very clear indication of where China is now going and what sort of China it is. That said, I don't think it's at all too late, or indeed at all impossible, for the West actually to have a really big impact on the way China behaves, particularly if the West acts in concert.
The Chinese economy rebounded from coronavirus faster than any other major economy, but also many in the West, with a lot of reason, have pointed the finger at the Chinese for having obscured, covered up the original outbreak. To what extent does there need to be a reckoning for the way that coronavirus initially emerged and was obscured by the Chinese government?
So I don't really know what a reckoning would add up to. What I do think, I think this is a very powerful example of just how bad the relationship has got, just how kind of short-termist both sides are behaving and thinking, rather than China welcoming in outside observers and analysts to understand, what had happened, how it had spread, where it's come from, and rather than the US, as it did with Ebola, sort of taking the lead, given the preeminence of its epidemiological talent and epidemiological institutions, we didn't have either of that. So, both sides, I think, are to blame for the fact that this has been, a pandemic from a multilateral perspective has been appallingly handled. So I'm not sure that, a reckoning sounds to me like a kind of, let's pin all the blame on you. Rather than pinning blame, I think it is much more like, how can we work together? There's an enormous amount that we need to work together on. It's not just getting a vaccine, it's making sure that the vaccine is globally available. There's a huge amount of stuff still to do. And, one would hope that you would have the world's two biggest economies working hand in glove. And I think actually, in the science area, there is much more cooperation, but the political theater is deeply negative. So yeah, China absolutely bears a lot of blame for that, but it's not just China.
Zanny Minton Beddoes, thank you so much. Great to be with you.
Thank you.
That's our show this week. Come back next week. And if you like what you see, and of course you do, because, that's why we spend so much time together, take a minute to sign up for GZERO's most excellent morning newsletter. It's called Signal.